Their son hired at the wealthy man's company. The man is shocked when he hears the black man's last name. Amara Grant stood in front of Richard Collins' desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather chair beneath her felt cold-like. A wealthy business owner wrongfully fires a black employee years later. Richard set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, looking at her with that same calculated expression she had seen so many times before Amara. Richard hadn't looked up from the papers he was reviewing, and the soft scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room, and it was driving her nerves up even more finally. Said her voice calm but distant, "I assume this is not about work." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She had practiced this conversation in her head for days, but now seated here in front of him, her voice felt stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. "No, it's not," she said softly, looking down at her hands. The silence that followed was suffocating Richard. He did not react. It seemed as though he had not heard her. The seconds stretched on each one heavier than the last, until finally he spoke. "I see that was it." "Nothing else," Amara blinked, her heart still racing. "It's yours." "Should know." Richard groaned, sitting forward in his chair, elbows on his desk as he steepled his fingers in front of him. "Amara," he started, his tone cold and measured. "This is unfortunate. Unfortunate." Her voice faltered, surprise creeping in. She had anticipated astonishment, wrath maybe. "This indifference, yes," Richard said, looking her straight in the eyes now, his expression cold. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach twisted. We were careful, clearly not careful enough," he replied, his words cutting through her like ice. He leaned back again, eyes narrowing slightly. "And now tell me." Amara's throat tightened. She hadn't thought far ahead. She hadn't expected it to be like this, hadn't thought he would be so cold. "I thought you would want to know. Maybe we could figure something out." Richard's face hardened. "Figure something out." Quietly, "I thought maybe. These things work. I'm married and have a family." He gestured between them. Never meant to be anything more than what it was. Words hit her like a punch to the gut. She realized now, late evenings in his office, whispered promises, stolen moments she had let herself believe it was something real. But to him, it had always been something disposable. Amara sat up straighter, gathering the last of her courage. "I am keeping the baby." "Richard," he sighed again, standing up from his desk and walking around to stand in front of her. "I cannot be involved in this, Amara. You know that this conversation, I can't just walk away, Richard. It's your child, too." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm warning you. Let this go." Never happened to understand. Her blood ran cold. "You should, too." Amara stood angry, starting to burn in her chest. "I can't just walk away. Taken care of you. But if you make this a problem for me, I will make sure you regret it." Her heart dropped. "What you are saying. I am saying this because this is your last day at Collins Associates." Her expression was icy. "I am saying this discreetly." HR's tone was businesslike, impersonal. "You will naturally get a severance package, but after today, you are no longer an employee here." The words hit her like a blow. "I am protecting my family, Amara, and you should protect yourself." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and dangerous if you try to come after me. Amara's hands shook, fury and disbelief. Wearing inside her, she stood there staring at the man she had once trusted, the man who now looked at her like a threat. She swallowed back the lump in her throat. "I never thought you would do." Amara's vision blurted with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction without another word. She turned and walked out of his office as she made her way back to her desk. Richard's voice was calm, as if this were just another business deal to her. Her hands moved mechanically as she packed her belongings. Every item felt heavier than the last in the elevator down to the lobby. She stared at her reflection in the polished walls, trying to hold herself together, but inside she was crumbling her job. Her future had seemed to have. She felt invisible, just another in the crowd. None would ever know the truth Richard Collins had made sure of. All had been ripped away in a matter of minutes. Now she was alone, pregnant, jobless, and blacklisted from the sector she had worked so hard to succeed in. The tears finally fell when she stepped out onto the street. She left the structure that had once housed her future and rested her hand on her stomach, where a fresh life was starting to blossom. She was not alone. She still had her child, and somehow they would survive the light, filtered through the blinds in Tyrrell's bedroom. Casting long shadows across the floor, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. Tyrrell could hear his mother moving about, getting ready for her day. For the 5th time, it was his first day at Sins Associates. His nerves were buzzing under his skin like electricity, looking sharp. He muttered to himself, trying to psych up as he straightened his posture from the kitchen. He grinned to himself, considering how proud she would be once he returned home with tales about his first day. He checked his phone 5 minutes until he had to leave time to get her blessing for the day ahead. Walking into the kitchen, he found Amara already seated at the small round table, her hands wrapped around a mug she looked at when he arrived. "Mom, how do you look?" Tyrrell grinned, spinning around to show off his suit. First day at Collins Associates. "This is big, right?" Amara nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Yeah, Tyrrell." Tyrrell stopped in his tracks. Amara's eyes dropped to the steam rising from her, avoiding his gaze. "I am happy for you. Just not sure about that place." She threw him off the excitement he expected to see in her. Instead, she looked worried. Mom asked, coming to sit across from her. Tyrell's brow wrinkled. "What do you mean?" "Collins Associates is among the best insurance companies in the nation. This could be quite significant for us." "I know, baby," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that place is not what you think." He stared at her, confusion spreading across his face. "Mean, did you know someone who worked there?" "Why you're worried?" Amara's hand tightened around the mug, and Tyrrell noticed how her knuckles, whitening her lips, pressed into a thin line, and for a second he thought she might say something more. But instead she just shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the tea. "It's nothing like that." Tyrrell leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of her sudden change in mood. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, pushing him to aim high. But now, when he was on the brink of something great, she seemed to be holding back, careful he could achieve anything if he worked hard enough. "I didn't go through all that school and those internships for nothing. This job could change everything for us." "I know," she said, looking up at him finally, her eyes shadowed with something that looked like fear. "But not everything is what it seems." His tone edging toward frustration. "Mom." Tyrell frowned, leaning forward. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you saying all this now? You were excited when I first told you about the job." Amara hesitated again, and Tyrell felt the tension between them grow thicker. It was like there was something unsaid, something heavy, hovering over their conversation. He couldn't understand what had changed. She finally said, her voice barely a whisper, "Some places they have shadows." Tyrell's frown deepened. "Shadows, Mom. It's a job and opportunity. I'm not some kid walking into a trap. This is going to help us." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked at. He softened, seeing the weight of whatever she was carrying, but he didn't know why. "I would be careful. I promise. But you have to trust me. I have worked hard for this, and I am not going to let anything ruin her." She nodded, though the worry never left her face. Though it was thin, as though it cost her something. "Good luck." Amara smiled. Tyrrell kissed her on the forehead before grabbing his briefcase and walking toward the door. Just before he stepped out, he looked back at her, and she was still. Tyrrell stood in the crowded car, gripping the pole, his thoughts racing. This was everything he knew. Sitting at the table, staring down into her tea, His face drawn and tense for the first time, doubt flickered in his chest. But he shook it off. This was his moment, and nothing would stop him. The subway ride into Midtown felt like the beginning of something big. If his mother was concerned, it was most likely just nerves after all this was. Had worked for the first step toward a successful career, and he was not going to let her strange warning get in his head. Collins Associates was one of the biggest names in the industry they did not hire. Had beaten out hundreds of applicants to get here. Tyrell stopped at the foot of the Collins Associates building. The glass tower loomed above him, sleek and imposing. The sunlight reflected off its mirrored surface, making it shimmer-like. She talked to her about a great change later when she was not so rattled. She was maybe scared of what it meant for their future. Something out of a dream. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. This is it. He thought this is where everything starts inside the lobby. Grand, filled with the quiet buzz of professionals moving quickly to wherever they needed to be. Tyrell checked in with the receptionist, and within minutes he was. Tyrell said as they entered the elevator, "Expecting a lot from you." His nerves turned to excitement again. "I am ready to get started." Miss Robinson, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a quick-paced welcome, gave him a brief nod. Good. Tyrell passed by and could feel the intensity of the place, the pressure to perform. As they moved across the floor, Tyrell spotted. They walked through the office, a maze of cubicles and glass-walled meeting rooms. Everything looked perfect. Tyrell could barely glance up. This was the guy who had created the firm from the bottom up, a man who epitomized everything Tyrell sought to accomplish. Richard Collins, the CEO himself, could not help but feel a thrill of respect as they passed. Richard's attention flicked toward him. Tyrell froze. Richard's face. His expression remained neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes, a brief flutter of recognition, almost like a shadow crossing his feet. Teachers. Then it was gone. Richard turned back to his conversation without another glance. Tyrell shook off. Richard Collins didn't know him. He was just another new hire still. Something about the look stuck with him, lingering in the rear of his mind as Miss Robinson showed him to his desk and gave him his first assignments as the day went on. Tyrell focused on his work. The thrill. Strange feeling, and continued walking. It was probably just his imagination. This was where he belonged, and he was going to prove himself. Even as he threw himself into his work, his mother's words rang in his head. "Some places have shadows, Tyrell." He shook his head, trying to clear the thought he wasn't in. Danger. He was here to succeed. Whatever shadows his mother feared, they could not touch him. Not here, not now. The office had settled into a rhythm by mid-morning, a quiet hum of keyboards and murmured conversations filling the open space. Tyrell sat at his new desk, his fingers flying across the keys as he familiarized himself with the workflow. While the work was simple, his supervisor, Miss Robinson, had given him a stack of papers to review. Collins Associates was a serious place, and everyone around him seemed laser-focused, but no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his ideas kept drifting back to that brief moment. Tyrell frowned, flipping through the pages of the report in front of him. It didn't make sense. Richard Collins. He knew he couldn't know him. He was just another new employee in a company of hundreds, maybe even thousands. Why would he be blind? First day jitters. Tyrell had always been prone to overanalyzing, especially when something big was at stake. He needed to focus, prove himself, and show the higher-ups that he belonged here. Lunchtime came and went. And he ate quickly at his desk, not wanting to waste. The CEO took note of him. He wasn't about to fall behind the reports he had been assigned. A single minute he had heard Collins Associates was a cutthroat player place where people were judged by their productivity and plowed through them, determined to make a good impression. But as the afternoon wore on, that unusual feeling from earlier kept. Richard Collins's appearance at him there was only one aspect that caught his attention. Another was something else, something he couldn't quite identify until later, when Miss Robinson visited to see how he was doing. "You're doing well," Tyrell said, glancing over his. Tyrell responded, leaning back slightly to stretch. Just trying to keep up with everything. You're handling it just fine. Keep it up. She started to walk away, but then paused and turned back, her face suddenly more serious. Mr. Collins wants to see you in his office now. Mr. Collins almost forgot. Tyrell sat at his desk, stunned. Why would Richard Collins want to see him on his first day? His heart started to pound as he stood up and straightened his jacket. This was not normal. New hires did not get. She did not explain. Tyrell made his way to the elevator, his palms growing moist. He tried to steady his breathing. This could be good news, right? Maybe Richard had been impressed by something in his resume, something that stood out. Suddenly summoned by the CEO, he looked around at his colleagues, but no one else seemed to notice him as they went about their work. Perhaps he wanted to personally welcome Tyrell to the business, but even as he tried to cool himself, a tiny voice in the back of his mind murmured something darker. Her words from that morning echoed once more, some places have shadows. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, Tyrell was greeted by an entirely different atmosphere from the... Everything about this place felt important, from the sleek furniture to the soft carpet underfoot. Busy lower levels, the executive floor was quieter, more polished with floor 2, selling windows leading in the afternoon light. Everything about this place felt important, from the sleek furniture to the knot tightening in his stomach. I am here to see Mr. Collins. Tyrell Grant, the receptionist, nodded and gestured to the big wooden doors behind her. She had perfect posture and a friendly smile. He expected you to walk straight in Tyrell's office. Her nerves were now fully active, and she took a deep breath, then pushed open the doors and entered Richard Collins' office. The room was massive with a panoramic view. Tyrell felt even smaller than he already did. Richard sat behind a big mahogany desk, his back to the window, glancing over some papers. He didn't look up immediately, and for a brief moment, Tyrell stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Finally, Richard looked up, his face expressionless. Tyrell. Richard Collins's presence was terrifying, even more so in the quiet of his office, so Richard began, his voice calm but measured. How's your first day going? Tyrell swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. Good, sir, I have. Richard nodded. Setting the papers aside, his gaze sharpened slightly. Now that's good to hear for a moment. There was something strange in the way he was looking at Miss Robinson. Working through the reports, everything was going well so far. Looking at him like he was looking for something or trying to place him. Tyrell felt the tension grow in the room. There is something specific you wanted to talk about. Mr. Collins, Richard's expression did not change. You're new here. Tyrell just starting here, but your name caught my attention. Tyrell's chest tightened. Tyrell's gaze lingered on him for another moment. Then he sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. It's a strong name, reminds me of someone I used to know. Narrowed just for a fraction of a second. He leaned forward slightly. Grant is not sure where this was going. Chest now, he could feel the weight of Richard's words hanging in the air. Richard didn't press further. Instead, he smiled faintly, a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. I like to keep track of the new talent coming into. Tyrell had figured out somehow in this brief conversation who Tyrell really was. If you ever need anything, Richard said, his tone still calm but laced with something Tyrell could not quite identify. My door is always open. Tyrell nodded again, swallowing hard. I will keep that in mind. He left the office with his heart still racing. Tyrell stood in the quiet corridor trying to process what had just happened. There was no reason Richard Collins should have taken an interest in him. Yet something about the way Richard had looked at him, the way he had mentioned. The door closed softly behind him. Tyrell returned to his desk, and the noise of the office washed over him. It seemed more than just a coincidence. The elevator ride back down felt longer than it should have. Tyrell's mother had been right there. It did little to calm the unease twisting in his gut. The familiar scent of home greeted him. Amara's cooking, the faint hint of lavender she always used to clean the place. The comfort of it, was almost enough to shake off the unusual tension that had followed him home after his key clicked into the lock. Amara was there, sitting on the couch with a book open in her lap. Her eyes weren't on the page. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. First day at Collins Associates almost, he set his briefcase down gently by the door, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room. Tyrell hesitated. How was he supposed to explain his day, the excitement of starting a new chapter, the strange feeling of being watched, of Richard Collins' eyes, that flutter of recognition? It had been a whirl of confusion, excitement and unease all wrapped together. It was fine, Tyrell said. Amara nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on him for too long. She wasn't convinced anything unusual happened. Tyrell paused, unsure of how much to share. She tried to sound convincing as he sat down on the couch beside her. I am working on a lot of reports, then stopped. His mother already seemed on edge about the entire job. Well, actually, I met Richard Collins today. Amar's hand tightened around the edge of her book. You met him? Tyrell noted. Yes. He called me up to his office. I have no idea why it was weird. She looked away. Tyrell noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened. At the mention of Richard, she wasn't surprised, not the way he thought she would be there. She leaned forward, her voice softening. Mom, what is it? Why are you acting like this? Tyrell frowned his stomach. What are you talking about? Omar's eyes met with regret and pain. Tyrell blinked, his mind struggling to process what had just said. His father, Richard Collins Trell. For a second, the words didn't make sense. Tyrell. Richard Collins. What? Tyrell's voice came out in a whisper that cannot be right. Amar nodded, her voice shaky but firm. It's true, Richard and I were involved a long time ago, before you were born. Tyrell shook his head, disbelief crashing through him. But you said my father left. You never told me who he was. I was trying to protect you, Tyrell. He stood, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced. How could you keep this from me? How could you not tell me, Amara? What kind of man? Tyrell's voice rose, a mixture of. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes, but she didn't look away. I wanted you to be hurt, Richard. He fired me, cut me off from everything, blacklisted me from the whole business when I tried to find work elsewhere. Anger and shock. You didn't think I deserved to know who my father is? Tyrell froze, the weight of her words settling in his blacklisted. You? Amara nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes. I could not get a job after that. I had no income, no support. It was just me and you, and I had to fight to make ends meet. He did not care. He just wanted me out of his life, and he did everything he could to make. Sure, I couldn't come back. His stomach turned. The man he had admired, the man he had just met in his office today, his father had left his mother with nothing, had abandoned him before he was even born. Why not? You tell me sooner. Tyrell asked, his voice quieter now, but still filled with. Heard all these years I asked you, but you never said anything. Why? Now Amara's face crumpled and she sank back down onto the couch. Her hands trembled. I thought I could keep it buried, but I didn't want you to ever know what kind of man he is. When you told me you got a job at Sins Associates, I couldn't keep it from you any longer. Tyrell stood there staring at her chest tight, with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, sadness. All these years he had been kept in the dark, and now everything was collapsing in front of him. Richard Collins felt a wave of nausea rise up him. You deserve to know the truth. I can't believe, Tyrell said, shaking his head. His father had known about him this entire time, and not only had he abandoned them, but also actively worked to destroy his mother's career, Amara said. I have been working for him, sitting in his office like I was just another employee. Tyrell's voice is weak. He doesn't know that's not the point. Mom destroyed your life, and now I'm supposed to just sit there and work for him, like nothing happened. Amara looked up at him, her eyes pleading. I didn't tell him this to make you hate him. Told you because I wanted you walking into that place knowing the truth, I didn't want you getting close to him only to be hurt all over again. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control his whole life. His father had imagined as a mystery, a man who had simply walked away. But the truth was so much worse. He paced the room, running his hands over his face. I don't even know what to do now. Do I confront him? Do I quit? Amara stood, placing a hand gently on his arm. That's your choice, Tyrell. Your choice is important. Richard is powerful and could ruin you just like he ruined me, Tyrell. Amara sighed, her face full of worry. I just wanted you to be safe. Tyrell stared at her, the weight of everything collapsing down around him. He didn't know what his next move was, but one thing was clear: he couldn't keep working for Richard Collins. The anger still burning in his chest. Amara nodded, her expression softening. Whatever you decide, Tyrell. Like nothing had happened, he couldn't keep pretending that the man who had abandoned him and destroyed his mother's life was just another CEO. I will figure it out. Tyrell said finally, his voice tight. But I can't keep working there. Everything had changed in a matter of minutes. The job he had thought would be his major break now felt like a betrayal. The man he had looked up was a stranger who had caused more damage than Tyrell could have imagined as he sat down beside him. Tyrell took a long breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. The subway rumbled under Tyrell's feet as he stared out the window, his reflection flickering in the dark tunnels. It had been 2 days since his mother had told him the truth. Tyrell felt the weight of the truth settle into his bones. The life he had known was gone. Now he had to decide what to do with the pieces left in their place. Days since everything he knew about his life had been turned upside down. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. Richard Collins' fists clenched as the thoughts sank in deeper. Every time he replayed that conversation in his head, it only made him angrier. The man he had met on his first day at Collins. Tyrell was working under him, like nothing had happened. The subway screeched to a stop and Tyrell snapped out of his thoughts. Associates had looked at him like he was nothing more than another employee, the man who had wrecked his mother's career, blacklisted her, and walked away without a second thought. And now Tyrell was working under him. Tyrell had to get himself together before he walked into the office. He couldn't let anyone see how close he was to the edge, not yet. Until he figured out what to do next, the cold morning air hit him, and he stepped out of the station onto the busy streets of Midtown. Collins Associates loomed ahead, its sleek glass tower rising against the sky. Felt like a symbol of his success, a place where he could prove himself. Now it felt like a cage trapping him in a twisted game he hadn't known he was playing. The office was bustling as usual. Tyrell walked in. Phones rang and the steady rhythm of keyboards filled the air. No one paid him much attention as he made his way to his desk, which was just fine with him. He needed time to think, but the moment he sat down, the weight of everything crashed down on him again. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking on the screen, but he couldn't focus. Every task felt meaningless in the shadow of what he now knew. How could he sit here and act like everything was normal? The worst part was that Richard didn't even remember him. Tyrell had seen in his eyes that first day. Richard was just another employee, another man who had walked away from his responsibility, had abandoned him and his mother without thinking twice. He glanced across the office to where Richard's assistant sat outside his corner office. The door was closed, as it often was, but Tyrell could picture him in there, seated behind his desk, as calm and collected as ever, running a company. Face in the crowd, he had no idea who Tyrell really was. That made Tyrell's blood boil even more. Managing hundreds of staff members, while the truth of his past remained buried, not for much longer, Tyrell thought grimly, he could not let this go. He could not just sit here knowing the truth and doing nothing, but what was he supposed to do? March into Richard's office and tell him everything, confront him in front of the whole company. Imagined it over and over in his head. Richard's startled face, the truth spilling out like a flood. But then what Richard had power influence, he could easily turn the situation against Tyrell, just as he had with his mother. Tyrell stared at his screen, the words of the report in front of him blurring together. He could not act recklessly. Ty tried to push through the tension that knotted his shoulders, but every time he looked up from his work, the sight of Richard's office made his skin crawl. The door remained closed. The man inside, completely unaware of the storm building just outside lunch, came and went. Tyrell barely touched. His mind was too full of ideas on what to do next. He couldn't stay here. But he couldn't just quit either without first facing Richard. He needed answers. He needed Richard to admit what he had done, but how? As Tyrell returned to his desk after lunch, his phone buzzed in his. Amar had been so concerned when he left that morning. Her eyes filled with the same fear she had tried to hide. He had not had the heart to tell her how much worse he felt today than he had yesterday. Pocket looked at the screen, a text from his mother. "How are you holding it?" Tyrell couldn't let it go. He couldn't walk away like nothing had happened. He needed Richard to understand the consequences of his actions. Years she didn't want him caught in Richard's world. She wanted him hurt the way she had been. But Tyrell could not let it go. Actions. The question was how to make that happen without losing everything in the process. The afternoon dragged on. Tyrell's frustration mounted. His work felt mechanical, every task just a distraction from the fury simmering beneath the surface. His head down, but inside his thoughts were racing. Tyrell finally, toward the end of the day, made up his mind he could not keep stewing in silence. He had to confront Richard face to face, no games, but he could not do it here in the middle of the office, not where everyone could see, not where Richard held all the power. Tyrell stood up from his desk, his heart pounding. He needed a plan. He needed Richard's dinner plans earlier in the day. Apparently Richard and his family often ate at a high-end restaurant, not yet catch Richard off guard, in a situation where he was not in control somewhere else, where Tyrell could speak freely. An idea began to form. Tyrell's jaw tightened. That would be his chance. He would go there, show up unannounced, and confront Richard in front of the people he cared about most. He would have him face the truth and acknowledge what he had done to Amara. Far from the office, a place where Richard could flaunt his success to the people who mattered most. Tyrell and he would do it, where Richard couldn't hide behind his office door. The plan wasn't perfect, but it gave Tyrell a sense of purpose, a way to channel the anger that had been eating at him for days. He couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't let Richard keep living his lie that evening. Tyrell sat on the subway, the lights flickering. Above him, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, his mind set on what he was about to do. He was naturally nervous, of course. He didn't know how Richard would react, but he had to do it. He couldn't let Richard get away with what he had done. He couldn't let Richard go with what he had done. Tyrell stood outside, observing the customers inside. Almost immediately, he was seated at a table near the window, just as he had imagined, an elegant place with glass windows and soft lighting. The kind of place people went to be seen. As Tyrell stood outside, Tyrell's heart raced as he walked through the door. His mind concentrated on one thing, making Richard Collins finally see him for who he was. Beside him and their son Elijah, they were laughing, enjoying their evening, completely unaware of the storm about to hit them. The noise of the restaurant faded. Richard's face tightened, his smile fading as he locked eyes with Tyrell Drew for a brief moment. There was only silence. At first he was too busy talking to his wife, gesturing with his hands as he recalled some story. Then, as Tyrell Drew walked closer, Richard's eyes lifted and froze the recognition. Tyrell stopped at the edge of the table, his heart thumping in his chest. This was it, the moment everything would come down. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, silverware clinking against plates and glasses being raised in soft toasts. It was the kind of place where everything was polished, elegant, where people came to be seen but never heard too loudly. Tyrell stood at the entrance, his heart racing, watching the man who had once been a distant mystery, but was now so close he could almost reach out and touch him. Richard Collins sat at the corner table, his back to the window, her perfectly seated alongside. Elijah's son, looking every bit the young man being groomed for success, was laughing unaware of the storm approaching. Tyrell swallowed his palms damp. This was it he had planned for this moment, but now doubt began creeping into the edges of his hair, catching the light from the chandeliers across from them. His fingers twitched by his sides as he walked to their table. Each step felt heavier than the last. Richard looked up. First their eyes locked across the space, and Tyrell saw it instantly, the flutter of recognition followed by the tightening of Richard's jaw. The easy smile that had been on Richard's face a moment ago faded, replaced by something. Richard's eyes hardened, his body tensing as though bracing for impact. Tyrell reached the table, standing just a foot away, his presence casting a shadow over their perfect family dinner. Tyrell, Richard. Cold or something that could not be hidden for a second, neither of them moved. Tyrell's heart pounded in his chest, set his voice low, his eyes darting fast to his wife and son before returning to Trell. "What are you doing here?" Tyrell felt his pulse quicken. Richard's tone was not welcoming. Defensive controlled, he glanced at Catherine and Elijah, who were now staring at him with confusion. "I am here for the same reason, Richard." "Dinner." Catherine raised an eyebrow, turning toward her husband. "Richard, is this someone from the office?" Richard cleared his throat, his expression tight. "Yes. Tyrell's a new employee." "A new employee." Catherine repeated, her eyes shifting between Tyrell and Richard, sensing something was. "What's going on?" Tyrell clenched his fists at his sides, his chest tight with the weight of everything unsaid. He could feel Richard's gaze burning into him, a silent plea to back down, to walk away. But Elijah sat across the table, leaned forward, looking Tyrell up and down. "Does not seem like a typical work meeting, Dad. What's going on?" Had come too far to turn back. "Now I'm not here about work," Tyrell said, his voice firm this time, directed squarely at Richard. "I am here about something else, something that happened a long time." Richard's expression darkened, his shoulders squared, and for the first time Catherine sensed the change. Leaned in closer to her husband, Richard's brows wrinkled. She asked softly what he was talking about, but instead he reached for his glass, his hand steady, but his grip tightened than required. He took a slow sip of wine, then his gaze never left Tyrell. "This is not the time or place for." "Richard, I think it's exactly the time and place." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched too far, like the moment before a dam breaks Tyrell's voice. Tyrell ignored him. His eyes darted to Catherine, then to Elijah, then settled back on Richard. "Another time." "No," Tyrell said, rising slightly. "We can discuss this another time." Richard's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something Tyrell could not quite place, panic perhaps, or maybe anger at being cornered like this. Try to control the situation. Richard's face was stony, his eyes locked on Tyrell. The tension in his posture gave him away. He did not want this conversation to happen here. He did not want the truth to come out. And what is he talking about? Catherine's hand touched Richard's arm. "I'm the son you abandoned." Catherine's eyes widened, her hand freezing in place. What Elijah's expression changed from confusion to shock. His mouth slightly opened as he looked from Tyrell to his father, Richard. That only strengthened Tyrell's resolve. 24 years ago, you fired my mother, blacklisted her from the industry you left her with. You left her with nothing and you walked away. Now I'm standing here working for you. Your face is pale, but your jaw is tight. You cannot deny it." Richard said nothing. The weight of the truth hung in the air, too heavy to avoid, too real. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Richard, is this true?" Elijah's expression hardened, eyes narrowing as he stared at his father, Dad. Tyrell felt the knot in his chest loosen, just slightly, as the truth finally started to break through Richard's carefully constructed life. He looked at Catherine. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice trembled. "You did this to someone and you never told me," Tyrell felt. Richard's face had lost of color. He opened his mouth to speak, But no words came out for the first time. His anger gave way to something else, almost like pity. You ruined her life. Tyrell continued, his voice quieter now, more controlled. You left us with nothing, and you think you could just go on living like none of it ever happened. Richard's voice broke through the tension, barely above a whisper. How could you? Richard finally speak. His voice was hoarse, weak. I made a mistake. I didn't think you would think it would come back to you, Tyrell said, finishing the sentence for him. But it did. Elijah's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger as he stared at his father. Dad, you seriously did this? You have a son you never told us about. Richard's hand trembled as he set his glass down on the table. Her eyes flicked between his family and Tyrell, trapped in a moment he couldn't control. It's never over, Richard. You hurt my mother. You hurt me. And now you're going to have to face that for a moment. No one spoke. The quiet hum seemed to disappear, leaving only the weight of the truth hanging in the air. Catherine's. I thought it was over. Tears fell silently, her eyes locked on the man she thought she knew. Elijah's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white with rage. Richard's eyes finally met Tyrell's again, and this time there was no more denial. Only the heavy burden of a past that had finally caught up with him. The restaurant felt cold, now the soft glow. Catherine wiped her tears. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the table in front of her. Richard. The world had come to a stop. Catherine whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. Long shadows cast over the table. The hum of conversation around her continued, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. Richard sat still, his face drained of color, staring at the glass of wine in front of him. His hands, once so steady, trembled slightly. He looked smaller now, as if the weight of his lies had finally pressed him down. Elijah leaned forward, his voice tight. Tyrell stood at the edge of the table, his chest heaving with a mix of emotions: rage, hurt, and something like vindication. The truth was finally out in the open, and now Richard could not hide behind his power or wealth. He could not pretend anymore. Richard's eyes flickered. You have another son. You ruined someone's life. I didn't want to hurt you. He started, his voice hoarse. I thought it was over. It was a mistake. A long time ago. Tyrell's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. You didn't just made a mistake. A long time ago. Tyrell's voice was sharp. Mother's life blacklisted her, left her with nothing. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You blacklisted her. Her voice cracked with disbelief. Richard, how could you do something like that? Richard's face twisted, the calm, opposing mask he had worn for so many years, crumbling in front his family. He opened his mouth to speak, but no. Richard finally stated, his voice low, almost begging. I couldn't let it come out. Words spilled out, and he looked trapped, as if everything he had fought to keep buried had now emerged. Now, there was no escape. I had a family, a profession I had to preserve. Tyrell watched as the man who had seemed untouchable now looked absolutely defeated. Richard's hands shook as he reached for everything I had built. Elijah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So you protected yourself and left him to suffer. His voice was full of disgust. You didn't care about them. Catherine's tears fell silently as she shook her head. I trusted you, Richard. I built a life with you. How could you lie to me like this? How could you do this to your own child? The word child seemed to hang in the air, the full weight of it sinking. I thought if I buried it, it would go away, that I could protect you from it. Catherine let out a bitter laugh, her voice breaking. Protect me from the truth? You didn't protect anyone, Richard. You just protected yourself. Richard's face twisted with guilt. Richard's eyes flicked with something like shame, but it was too little, too late. Tyrell had lived his life in comfort, building an empire. You thought you could just erase us, pretend like we didn't exist. Richard is real. and we have been living with the consequences of your choices every day." Elijah's face was hard, his voice dripping with disgust. "You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect image, but it's all a lie. Not one excuse or justification could make up for this. How many other secrets are there?" Catherine's voice cracked once more, her eyes red and swollen from the tears. "After all this, you have been lying to me for over 20 years, Richard. I do not even know who you are anymore." Tyrell's heart twisted at the sight of Catherine's pain. She had been caught in the middle of this, oblivious of the life her husband had left behind, but Tyrell couldn't let herself feel pity for her. Not yet. She was just as much a victim of Richard's lies as he and his mother had been. But there was still so much she didn't know. Her voice filled with a quiet. Everywhere she went, she was shut out. He blacklisted her, ruined her reputation. We struggled for years while he sat here living like nothing had happened. Catherine's face crumpled as the full weight of Tyrell's words sank in her. Cold anger. My mother, Amara, tried to get back on her feet. Richard's hands trembled as he set his glass down on the table, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. "I knew what else I could do," he said weakly. "I was scared." Elijah spat, his voice rising. "You." Richard's fear had cost him everything. "You don't get to be scared." Tyrell said, his voice trembling with. He felt the wrath bubbling up inside him once more, but this time it was for his mother, for all the years she had struggled, all the sacrifices she had made just to keep them going. "I'm sorry," he whispered, hollow and weak. "I'm so sorry." But Tyrell wasn't interested in apologies, not now, not after everything. Richard looked up at Tyrell, his eyes filled with something almost like regret. Richard opened his mouth to say, but Catherine cut him off, her voice shaking with anger. Tyrell opened his mouth to speak. "You don't get to say sorry and walk away, Richard. You lied to us and destroyed their lives." She turned to Tyrell, her expression softening as fresh. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Tyrell. I didn't know any of this." Tyrell looked at her. His anger still simmered. "But," he nodded, "I know this isn't your fault." Elijah, who had been silent for a moment, spoke up again, his voice filled with disbelief. "So what now are we supposed to do with this, Dad? Pretend like nothing happened?" Catherine said softly, her voice filled with suffering. "We have to face." Tyrell's chest tightened as he watched Richard. Richard did not reply. He looked down at the table, his hands shaking, his face pale. The man who had once seemed so powerful, now reduced to a shell of the person he had pretended to be. "I've said what I needed to say," Tyrell said, his voice steady, but cold now. "It's up to you to decide how to handle it." Catherine's tears fell. This man who had caused so much damage sitting there in silence, unable for answer for his actions. The truth had finally come out, and now the family he had built on Line Eyes was crumbling around him. Richard's betrayal had destroyed their family, and there was no going back. Richard finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll fix this, I'll make it right." But Tyrell shook his head. "You can't fix this, Richard. You can't undo what you have done." The weight on his chest relaxed just a little. The confrontation was over, and the truth had finally been exposed, but the damage had been done, and there was no turning back the buzz around the office at Collins Associates. With that, T turned away from the table, leaving them to grapple with the truth. Though everyone inside the building could see the cracks forming around the man who had built an empire, Tyrell sat. Different today, conversations that were usually light and professional had a sharp edge of gossip. Eyes darted toward Richard Collins's office. The glass walls seemed more transparent than ever. Richard Collins, the untouchable CEO, was no longer invisible. He stared at the report in front of him, the words, a blur he should have felt some sense of. The news had spread faster than he expected. Now the whispers had turned into open discussions. Everyone knew, knowing that the man who had destroyed his mother's life was at last paying for his actions. But instead he felt a quiet emptiness inside him. The wrath that had driven him to face Richard was no more blazing now. There was just the fallout. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Tyrell sighed, typing a quick reply. It's all over the office now. Everyone knows. Her reply came almost instantly. He hesitated before responding. I think so, just trying to figure out what comes next. Tyrell leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the far end of the office where Richard's door remained. Closed. No one had seen him come in today, and rumors were already whirling. Some said he was hiding out in his home, avoiding the public eye. Others speculated that he was meeting with lawyers, trying to protect himself from the storm that was brewing. It didn't matter. The truth was out now, and there was no going back by noon Tyler's. His heart raced as he clicked it open. Dear team. Phone buzzed once more, but this time it was not a text from his mother. Rather, it was a company-wide email with a simple subject line. Richard Collins has resigned from his position as CEO of Collins Associates, the board of which is. Thank you for your continuous dedication. Richard was out for a moment. His hand tightened around his phone. Directors have appointed an interim CEO while the company moves through this period. We remain committed to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the company. It was not the triumph Tyrell had dreamed of. Instead, there was staring at the email, letting the words sink in. The man who had wielded so much power, who had made decisions that destroyed lives, without a second thought, lose his seat at the top. Now that it was real. Tyrell's phone buzzed once more, dragging him from his thoughts. Another text from his mother. I just saw the news. You are okay. He stared at the message for a long period before responding. Yeah, he's done, but it does not feel like what I thought. The truth was out and Richard was gone. The cost of it still weighed. Her response was slower this time, more careful. It would not feel like you expected, Tyrell. You did what you had to do. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over him. Tyrell kept his head down, avoiding the curious stares that some of his colleagues threw his way. He didn't want to be part of the gossip. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to get through the day. As the hours passed, pulled on, Tyrell knew he could not avoid it permanently. At some point, he would have to face the reality of what had happened, not just to Richard, but also to himself. He had spent so long building up to that moment of confrontation. So long. Imagining what it would feel like to finally make Richard Collins pay for what he had done. But now that it was. Tyrell looked up to see his supervisor, Miss Robinson, standing there, her face unreadable. Over, Tyrell was left with the fallout. He was still working at the company Richard had built. The company had in part been built on lies. She asked, her voice calm, but... Miss Robinson closed the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the table, so she began, her tone measured. I'm sure you have seen the news. Tyrell followed her to a quiet conference room at the back of the office. The room was small, with glass walls offering a view of the bustling floor outside. Tyrell nodded, unclear of where this conversation was going. Yeah. She watched him for a moment. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I know about your connection to Richard. Tyrell's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that you do. Miss Robinson nodded slowly. Word gets around. Tyrell felt a familiar. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Mostly that you were his son. That the confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private. Tightness in his chest. The fear of being exposed creeping in. What exactly are they saying? She dropped. He hadn't thought about the restaurant, had been busy, filled with people who were. Tyrell said, his voice low. I just needed to confront him for what he did. Miss Robinson nodded, her expression softening. I get it. I don't blame you, but you need to be careful. Tyrell, this company is going. Probably just as interested in the gossip as they were in their meals. Tyrell swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. What do you mean? I mean, you need to decide what you want to do, she said quietly. Staying here working at the company your father built, it's going with challenges. Right now, Richard is stepping down here. People are going to ask questions and they are going to want answers. Tyrell stared at her, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about the aftermath working here, staying in the shadow of his father's legacy. It was not just about the job. Tyrell nodded gently, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. Thanks. I'll think about it. Miss Robinson gave him a little nod before stepping out of here. Now you don't have to decide right now. Miss Robinson added, her voice softer now. Think about it. The sun had dropped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. He walked slowly, his mind heavy with everything that had happened. Richard was gone. He had stepped down, forced out by the truth Tyrell had exposed. Now Tyrell was left with. All he knew was that the truth had changed everything, and now he had to find his place in the aftermath. He could stay at Collins Associates knowing the history behind the success of the company, or was it time to move on and leave the shadow of his father behind? Reached his apartment. Tyrell's phone buzzed again. Another text from his mother. Come home. We will figure this out together. Tyrell smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He had confronted the past now. It was time to decide what kind of future he wanted to build. Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, the familiar warmth of his. It was a quiet moment, but the weight of the past few days still lingered in the room Amara was at. Her back turned to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't said much since she. The scent of freshly made coffee filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of the radio in the background. Hadn't figured that out yet, but at least here in this little familiar space the world didn't seem as heavy. Amara set the pot aside and turned to face him, wiping her hands. Had walked through the door the night before, and Tyrell knew she was waiting for him to tell her what had happened. Tyrell looked at her, the weariness in his bones too heavy to hide. He stepped down. Richard's gone, the company's already announced. Amar's eyes softened as she sat down across from him. I heard it's all over the news. Tyrell nodded, rubbing his hands together. Tried to locate the words. It doesn't feel like Mom. I thought it would be Mom. I thought I wouldn't feel something more relief, maybe satisfaction. But Amara reached across the table and put a hand on his. That's because this is about everything we went through, and nothing. He does now undo what happened. Tyrell looked down at her hand, the lines of wear and resilience etched on her skin. She had been through so much, carried so much weight for so many years, and now even with Richard out of the picture, the scars remained. I don't know what to do next. Tyrell admitted, his voice quiet. Staying at the company feels wrong, but leaving. Amara nodded, her eyes full of understanding. You don't have to decide everything right now, Tyrell. You have already done the hardest part you faced. You made him own what he did. Tyrell swallowed hard, the memories of that confrontation still fresh in his mind. I just keep thinking about all. Tyrell's expression softened and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but strong. It was worth it, Tyrell. You deserve to know the truth, and no matter how terrible it was, you needed to hear it. Tyrell let out a shaky. Tyrell's voice barely above a whisper. Amara's hand tightened around his. Breath, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. Even though the truth had shattered the image of the father he had imagined, it was still his truth. And now, with everything laid bare, he could finally start to move forward. I just don't know where to go from here, Tyrell said. Tyrell met her eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt a flutter of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. You're right. Strong, Tyrell, stronger than you know you've been through. Now you get to decide what happens next. You get to build the life you want, without anyone holding you back. Tyrell stayed with his mother, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner together and sharing stories about. Said softly, I can move on from this. Amara smiled, a small, tired smile, but one that held a world of strength. We both can. The day passed slowly, but it was filled with small moments of comfort. Anything except Richard Collins. For the first time in what felt like eternity, They let themselves enjoy the simplicity of being together without the weight of the past hanging over them later that evening as they sat on the couch, viewing a rerun of an old sitcom. Tyrell turned to Amara, the question that Tyrell asked silently. Amara's gaze stayed fixed on the TV, her face thoughtful. We already have, in a way. Tyrell frowned, confused. What do you mean? She turned to him. Had been on his mind all day, finally pushing their way to the surface. Expression calm. But resolute justice isn't always about punishment. Tyrell, sometimes it's about survival. Richard may have destroyed my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. Now we're stronger than we would have been if he had stayed in our lives. Tyrell stared at her, the depth of her words sinking in. She was right. Justice isn't just about seeing him fall. Amara continued, her voice steady. It's about us standing tall, and we're still standing. Tyrell felt a lump. They had survived despite everything Richard had done, built a life. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fair. He had spent so long concentrated on the idea of bringing Richard down, of making him pay for what he had done, but now, sitting here with his mother, he realized that the real victory was in the fact that they had made this far, despite the emotions whirling inside him. Too complicated to put into words. Amara squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride, and we always will be the next morning. Tyrell woke up feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight of the past was still there, but it did not feel as suffocating as it had. Trell said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The world outside was calm, peaceful, as he poured a cup for him and his mother. He considered the decisions he would have to make. He could stay at Collins Associates, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized the company represented. Before he stood in the kitchen making coffee, the early morning light streamed through the window. Amara walked into the kitchen still in her robe and smiled when she saw him mourning. She said, her voice soft but warm. Richard's legacy. Not his. He needed to start fresh to build something of his own, untainted by the shadow of his father's past. He handed her a cup of coffee. There was peace between them now, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. Finally, Tyrell broke the silence. I think I'm going to leave Collins Associates. Amara looked at him, her expression calm but supportive. The quiet stillness of the morning settled over them for a long time. Neither of them spoke. Amara nodded, pride shining in her eyes. I think that's a great idea. Tyrell smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. I know Tyrell said drinking his coffee, but I think it's the right move I should do. I cannot stay there working under the shadow of what he did. They stayed there for some more time, discussing the opportunities that the future held for the people. First time in years, Tyrell felt he had control over his own life. Past would always be there, but it no longer. Had the ability to define him. He had confronted his father, discovered the truth, and now he could construct the life he had wanted. Sought one defined by his decisions. Not Richard's blunders, as the rising light climbed higher in the heavens. Tyrell turned to check on his mother, his heart full of thanks for everything they had gone through together. We created. He whispered softly, a little grin on his lips. Amara smiled back, eyes full of love and pride. Indeed we did.